A young black boy stands before the judge, his eyes filled with hope. Then, an unbelievable and shocking event unfolds, something you'll never forget. He looks at her and says four unexpected words, "You're my mom." The seats were packed, as usual, with spectators, attorneys, and legal professionals, all whispering in hushed voices as they waited for the next case to begin. The air was thick with the usual tension that came with legal proceedings. Every motion, every word spoken carried weight. But today was different. All eyes were fixed on the front of the room, where a small, lone figure stood at the witness stand. Unlike the usual witnesses, adults in business suits, expert testimonies, or hardened individuals entangled in the justice system, today, the person standing there was a child, a boy, no older than 8, gripped the wooden railing in front of him with small, trembling hands. His knuckles were white, his shoulders stiff, yet his dark eyes burned with an undeniable sense of determination. His heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let fear control him. Taking a deep breath, he lifted his chin and spoke with remarkable clarity. "My name is John Smith, and I don't want to live in any other house. I only want to stay with my family." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. People exchanged confused glances, whispers rising slightly in volume. Even some of the attorneys, who were trained to remain neutral and focused, turned their heads in surprise. What was this boy talking about? At the front of the courtroom, seated high at her bench, was Judge Emily Carter. She was a woman of immense authority, a respected figure with decades of experience. She was known for her sharp intellect, unwavering discipline, and the kind of presence that commanded silence without needing to raise her voice. For years, she had seen it all: complicated family disputes, life-altering custody battles, heartbreaking testimonies from children caught in the legal system. She had learned to steel herself against emotions, to rule fairly without becoming personally involved. But something about this boy made her pause. She narrowed her eyes slightly, studying him. Then, leaning forward just enough to show she was paying attention, her voice softened, not in weakness, but in genuine curiosity. "What do you mean by that, John?" The boy hesitated for only a moment. Then, as if he had been waiting for her to ask, he suddenly stood taller, his voice rising with newfound strength. "I want to stay with my family, and my mother is Judge Emily Carter." Silence. For a moment, the entire courtroom froze. The lawyers, the clerks, the jury members, the bailiffs, everyone stopped what they were doing. Some of the attorneys had been flipping through their case files, jotting down notes, or preparing their next statements, but now, their pens hovered in midair. The stenographer's fingers remained suspended above the keys. Judge Carter didn't react immediately, not because she wasn't shocked, but because she was too shocked to react. A child, an 8-year-old boy, had just stood before a courtroom full of people and declared her as his mother. It was a statement that shattered the rigid walls of formality, throwing an unexpected emotional weight into the proceedings. People in the courtroom exchanged bewildered glances, some leaning toward one another in whispers. Was this a mistake? Had the child confused her with someone else? Others simply gaped in stunned silence, waiting to see what the judge would say next. Up at the judge's bench, Emily Carter's breath was steady, but her mind raced. She was known for her composure, for handling difficult cases without ever letting emotions cloud her judgment. But this was different. Her grip on her gavel tightened slightly before she carefully relaxed her fingers. She couldn't react rashly. She had to understand. She looked down at the boy again, at John Smith, with his earnest eyes and small hands still gripping the railing. The courtroom remained frozen in silence, the weight of John's words still hanging in the air. Judge Emily Carter sat motionless, her sharp eyes locked onto the small boy standing before her. Though her face remained unreadable, her heart was racing in a way it hadn't in years. A flood of emotions surged through her, memories long buried beneath the weight of time clawing their way to the surface. She had loved once, deeply, fiercely. Her first and only love had been a young man with kind eyes and a brave soul, a man who had sworn to return to her after he was forced to go to war. But he never did. He had died in battle, leaving her with nothing but heartbreak and the echoes of what could have been. She had never married. She had dedicated herself to her career, to justice, to making sure the world remained fair even when it hadn't been for her, which meant there was no possibility, none, that this boy standing before her could be her son. A few minutes passed, just enough time for her to gather her composure. John's hopeful eyes never wavered. He truly believed what he was saying, and it shattered something deep within her. Emily let out a quiet breath, steadying herself. Then, with the same strength that had carried her through years of hardship, she finally spoke. "John," her voice was softer than usual, lacking its usual sharp authority. "I don't know what you've been told or where you heard this, but," she hesitated, knowing this next part would hurt him, "I am not your mother." The moment the words left her lips, something inside her ached. The boy's expression faltered, his small fingers gripping the wooden railing even tighter. His lower lip trembled slightly, but he didn't cry. He simply stood there, absorbing the truth, one he clearly wasn't prepared to hear. She wanted to comfort him, to reach out and tell him that she wished things were different, that she wished she could give him what he was looking for. But she couldn't lie. Not to him. Emily Carter had spent her life mastering the art of composure. No matter the case, no matter the stakes, she had always remained unshaken, a pillar of authority in the courtroom. But today, for the first time in her long career, she felt uncertain, because John wasn't looking away. Even after she told him the painful truth, the boy's wide, determined eyes remained locked onto hers. There was something in his gaze, not just sorrow, but something deeper, conviction, a quiet, unwavering belief that she had not expected. Then, with trembling hands, John reached into the pocket of his small jacket and pulled out a photograph. The paper was old, slightly worn at the edges. His hands trembled slightly as he held it up toward her. His voice, though shaky, carried a weight that made the room feel even heavier. "My godmother at the orphanage gave me this photo. She told me this was the only thing left of my real family." He swallowed hard, his lips trembling before he spoke the next words. "The woman in this picture, she has the same face as you, and she's wearing the same necklace." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She froze, staring at the small photograph in his hand. It was too far away for her to see the details clearly, but something in John's voice made her entire body tense. Slowly, almost mechanically, she stood up from her chair, stepping down from the judge's bench. The courtroom was deathly silent. Even the murmurs from the audience had ceased. Everyone watched as she took careful steps toward the boy, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. When she was close enough, John lifted the photo with both hands. Emily hesitated before reaching out. Her fingers trembled slightly as they grasped the fragile piece of paper. And the moment she saw it, the world around her stopped. The image staring back at her was one she had long buried in the deepest parts of her memory. A much younger version of herself, barely out of her teenage years. She was standing outside a hospital, her hand resting protectively over her stomach, and around her neck, hanging just above her heart, was a silver necklace, the same one she was wearing now. Her knees almost buckled. Her hands tightened around the edges of the photo, as if afraid it would disappear. She hadn't seen this image in decades. In fact, she hadn't even known this picture existed. Her mind raced, memories colliding with the present. The love she lost, the baby she mourned, the unbearable grief that had kept her from ever trying again. She had given birth to a child once, but that child hadn't survived. Or so she had been told. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Her body felt cold, her breath shallow. There was no logical explanation for this. None. But John's face, the intensity in his eyes, the way he looked at her as if he already knew her soul. It was impossible, unthinkable. But was it? Had she spent the last 8 years believing a lie? A shaky breath escaped her lips. Her voice, for the first time in years, wavered. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. John swallowed. "My godmother gave it to me. She said my mother left me at the hospital, but that she loved me, that she didn't want to, that she had no choice." His small fists clenched at his sides. She told me my real mom didn't even know I was alive. Emily's vision blurred. Her pulse roared in her ears. The room tilted around her as the unbearable truth settled in her bones. Something wasn't right. Something had been terribly, terribly wrong for the past 8 years. Her hands clenched around the photo, her breath shaky, her heart caught between hope and fear. If this was real, if there had been some kind of terrible mistake, if she had been robbed of the truth, then this boy standing in front of her wasn't just another case. He was her son. She felt her throat tighten as she turned back toward the courtroom. Everyone was watching, waiting for her to respond. She could feel the weight of their gazes, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. But there were no immediate answers. She couldn't make a decision here. Not now. Her voice, though shaking, carried authority as she turned to the court clerk. "I am ordering an immediate suspension of today's proceedings," she announced, struggling to keep her emotions from cracking through her tone. "The court will reconvene in 2 weeks after further investigation." There was a stunned pause before the gavel slammed onto the bench. The case was far from over, and neither was the mystery of John Smith. Emily Carter sat in her office, the weight of the day pressing heavily on her chest. The courtroom was behind her now, but John's voice, his unwavering belief that she was his mother, still echoed in her mind. Her hands hovered over her desk phone for a moment before she finally pressed the button. The line rang once before a familiar voice answered. "Judge Carter?" It was Andrew, her most trusted assistant, the young man she had mentored from the very first day he entered the legal field. He had grown into a capable investigator, someone she trusted with everything. And today, she needed him more than ever. Taking a steady breath, she spoke. "Andrew, I need you to investigate something for me." Her voice was firm but laced with emotion. "Find out what happened in the maternity ward 8 years ago. That child, John Smith, was declared dead at birth. And yet, he stood in my courtroom today, calling me his mother." A heavy silence followed before Andrew responded. "I'm on it." Within hours, Andrew had dug deep into the town's hospital records from that year. His research led him to something disturbing, something that made his stomach turn. There had been 2 babies born that night. One belonged to Emily Carter. The other belonged to a wealthy, powerful family with deep connections in the town. Their influence could bend laws, silence doctors, and make problems disappear. And that's exactly what they had done. The truth was horrifying. The elite family had lost their child during birth, but rather than accept their fate, they had used their wealth and influence to switch the babies. Emily's son, the child she had been told was dead, had been taken from her arms before she even had the chance to hold him. And the life he had been forced to endure after that? It was nothing short of hell. John had never known the warmth of a real home. His first years were spent in a wealthy but loveless household. His adoptive parents, the same powerful family that had taken him, had no love for him. He was nothing but a replacement, a shameful reminder of their own lost child. They never truly accepted him, never showed him affection. Instead, they resented him. As a toddler, he had been ignored, neglected, and locked away in a cold, sterile nursery while his parents paraded around in high society, pretending he was their own. But he never felt like theirs. He felt like a prisoner. Then, when he was 4 years old, something even worse happened. They got pregnant again. This time, the baby was truly their own, a real child of their blood. And suddenly, John became useless, unwanted, a mistake they no longer needed to keep. So, they gave him up. After being abandoned by the elite family, John was placed into the foster care system. At first, he hoped, that this would be a second chance. Maybe, just maybe, he would finally find a family that loved him. But hope was a cruel thing. The first home he was sent to belonged to a couple who saw foster children as nothing more than a source of government checks. They didn't care about him. They barely spoke to him. He was a burden, a mouth to feed, an obligation they had taken on only for financial gain. They left him hungry most nights, alone in a small, damp basement with a thin mattress and a single flickering light bulb. When he cried, they told him to shut up. When he asked for food, they told him to be grateful for what he had. When he made a mistake, they hit him, John learned quickly that love was not something given freely. When social workers eventually removed him from that house, he thought, finally, he would be safe. But the next home was even worse. His second foster father was an angry, violent man. He drank constantly, his breath always reeking of alcohol, his hands always ready to strike. John learned to flinch at loud noises, to move carefully, to never be noticed. But no matter how quiet he was, how obedient he tried to be, the beatings came anyway. His ribs had been bruised more times than he could count. His arms had been grabbed so roughly that he stopped wearing short sleeves because the bruises took too long to fade. And when he cried, his foster father laughed. "No one's coming for you," he would sneer. "No one wants you." And John believed him. He was moved from home to home, each one breaking him a little more, each one making him believe that maybe, just maybe, he really was worthless. Until, eventually, he ended up at the orphanage. Emily Carter sat in her dimly lit office, her hands clenched tightly on the desk as Andrew finished his report. Each word he spoke felt like a dagger to her heart. The more she learned about John's past, the harder it became to breathe. Neglect, abuse, abandonment. All these years, she had lived under the belief that her child, her son, had died the day he was born. Yet, here he was, standing in her courtroom, alive, but utterly broken by the horrors he had endured. Her fingers curled into fists as her chest tightened. She had fought for justice her whole life, for strangers, for victims, for those the system failed. But now, the system had failed her own son. She couldn't let this go unanswered. She wouldn't. But there was one more thing she needed to be sure of. Taking a deep breath, she turned to Andrew, her voice firm yet laced with quiet desperation. "Order a DNA test," she said. "I need confirmation. I need to know, without a doubt, that John is mine." Andrew nodded without hesitation. "I'll make the arrangements right away." As Andrew prepared to leave, something on his laptop screen caught his attention, something that made his blood run cold. He had been digging through old hospital records, checking for anything unusual surrounding John's birth. But what he found was far worse than he had expected. There wasn't just one case of a baby being switched. There were dozens. Some files had been conveniently erased, others locked under private medical access, but the pattern was clear. Over the past 15 years, multiple infants from lower-income families had been stolen and replaced with newborns from elite, wealthy families who had either lost their own children or didn't want to deal with medical complications. It was a highly orchestrated child trafficking ring. Andrew's stomach twisted. This wasn't just an isolated case of one wealthy family manipulating the system. It was an operation, an entire network of corruption deeply embedded in the hospital system. His hands trembled as he printed out the files, compiling the evidence. Judge Carter needed to see this. When Andrew returned with the newfound evidence, Emily's eyes widened with shock as she flipped through the documents. This is monstrous," she murmured. Her stomach turned as she read case after case. Children stolen from their rightful families, replaced to benefit the rich and powerful. Some of them had grown up never knowing the truth. Others, like John, had suffered unimaginable cruelty. The realization sent a wave of fury through her veins. This wasn't just about John anymore. How many more children had been stolen? How many mothers had been lied to? Just as she had? Emily slammed the file shut, her decision clear. "Take all of this to the police," she ordered. "We're going to tear this entire operation apart." For years, she had ruled in the courtroom, ensuring that justice prevailed. But now, she was fighting for something far more personal, and she would not rest until every guilty party paid for what they had done. The day of the second trial arrived, but unlike before, it was delayed out of anticipation. The custody battle, it was bigger. When the doors finally opened, the seats were filled with journalists, lawyers, victims' families, and concerned citizens. Everyone knew this wasn't just another trial. This was about justice, not only for John, but for countless others who had suffered in silence. At the front of the room, John was present, but he was no longer in the witness box as a pleading child. This time, he was a key witness. Emily Carter sat at the judge's bench, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. But beneath that composed exterior, a storm raged within her. This was no longer just about her personal tragedy. This was about every stolen child, every grieving mother, every life that had been shattered by greed and corruption. She had spent the past few weeks preparing for this moment, ensuring that every piece of evidence was in place. Every witness, every statement, every document had been reviewed, scrutinized, and verified. There would be no loopholes, no escape. Those responsible would face the consequences. The prosecution stood and began laying out the charges. Multiple individuals, including doctors, hospital administrators, and influential figures from high society, were facing serious criminal accusations. This is more than just a single case, the prosecutor declared, his voice echoing through the courtroom. This is a systematic abuse of power. For years, newborn children have been stolen, switched, and sold into lives they were never meant to live. This was not an accident. This was a crime. Murmurs rippled through the room as the evidence was presented one by one. The hospital records, which had been deliberately tampered with, were retrieved and restored. Financial transactions between hospital staff and wealthy families were exposed. Testimonies from former employees revealed the shocking truth. The illegal baby trade had been operating for decades. Emily listened intently, her heart heavy with the weight of what she was hearing. She had spent her life fighting for justice, but never before had a case felt this personal. And then, it was John's turn to speak. He walked up to the stand, his small frame, still so young, looking out of place in the imposing courtroom. But his eyes were strong. He had lived through hell. He had been abused, abandoned, and made to believe that no one wanted him. But now, he was standing before the world, telling his story. Taking a deep breath, he began. My name is John Smith. I am 8 years old, and I was stolen from my real mother the day I was born. The courtroom fell silent. John recounted the years of neglect, the nights of hunger, the bruises, the pain. I wasn't given love. I was given fists. I wasn't given comfort. I was given cold, dark rooms. Every time I was sent to a new family, I hoped, just once, that someone would keep me. But they never did. His voice didn't waver. He wasn't just telling his story. He was exposing the truth. I never knew why I was being passed around like I didn't matter. But now I do. Because I was never supposed to be in those houses. I was supposed to be with my real mother, the one who was told I was dead. Emily's fingers clenched tightly on the wooden bench. She wanted nothing more than to embrace him, to tell him that he would never be alone again. But right now, this was his moment. These people, John continued, turning toward the defendants, stole me. They stole other kids. They lied. And they hurt people. And they thought they would never get caught. He turned back to the judge's bench, to Emily, his voice clear, unwavering. But now they have. The evidence was undeniable. The testimonies, the financial trails, the forged documents. There was no way out. One by one, the defendants were convicted. The doctors, who had accepted bribes to falsify birth records, received lengthy prison sentences. The hospital administrators, who had enabled the crimes, were stripped of their licenses and sentenced. The wealthy families who had purchased stolen children faced charges of child trafficking. For the first time in years, justice was delivered. The courtroom erupted as the final verdict was read. Some wept with relief. Some cheered. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process the magnitude of what had been revealed. Emily exhaled slowly, her grip on the gavel tightening. Then, with finality, she slammed it down one last time. Case closed. As the courtroom emptied, John remained seated. His small hands rested on the wooden table, his eyes staring ahead. It was over. For the first time in his life, the people who had hurt him had been punished. And for the first time, he felt something he had never known before: hope. Emily stood from the bench and walked toward him. When she reached his side, she knelt down, meeting him at eye level. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a soft but steady voice, she said, "John, you are not alone anymore." His eyes widened, his small fingers gripping the edge of the table. "You mean?" he whispered. Emily smiled, a rare, genuine smile that she hadn't worn in years. "You are my son, and I am your mother. If you'll have me." The walls he had built around his heart shattered. Tears welled in his eyes as he nodded fiercely. Unable to speak, Emily opened her arms, and John, for the first time in his life, ran into them, wrapping his arms around her. The courtroom had witnessed justice, but for John, this moment was more than justice. It was home. The case of John Smith wasn't just another legal battle. It became a national scandal that sent shockwaves through society. News outlets covered every detail, from the shocking baby-switching conspiracy to the elite families who had used their power to manipulate the system. For weeks, headlines screamed across newspapers and television screens. "Stolen at birth, the child who found his mother in court." Judge Emily Carter's emotional reunion with her long-lost son. Exposing the underground child-swapping network. Justice finally served. People across the country were outraged, demanding stricter laws and harsher punishments for those involved. There were protests outside the hospitals that had allowed this to happen, and government officials launched deeper investigations into other missing children cases. But while the world was watching, debating, and reacting, John was finally beginning his new life. Emily had made a silent promise to herself the moment she held John in her arms after the trial. She would give him the life he had been robbed of. She moved carefully, never wanting to overwhelm him. He had lived through years of instability and pain. Adjusting to a loving home would take time. At first, John was hesitant. His past had taught him that nothing good lasted forever. He was used to people giving up on him. He was used to being told that he wasn't wanted. He was used to believing that love was temporary. So when Emily showed him his new room, a cozy space decorated with his favorite books and soft blankets, he didn't unpack right away. "You don't have to keep me if it's too much," he had whispered one night, standing in the doorway of her study, his small fingers twisting into his sleeves. Emily's heart clenched. She walked over, kneeling in front of him so they were eye level. "John," she said softly but firmly, "you are my son. You are home. And nothing will change that." That was the moment he allowed himself to believe. Slowly, day by day, he settled in. Emily helped him adjust to school, walking him to class on his first day. At first, he was nervous, afraid of being different, afraid of being seen as the kid from the trial. But his classmates welcomed him, and his teachers encouraged him. For the first time in his life, he felt like a normal kid. Emily did everything she could to fill the voids left in John's heart. She made sure he had warm meals every night, not just food, but meals made with love. She sat beside him when he did his homework, answering every little question patiently. She cheered the loudest when he joined a school club, despite his initial hesitation. One day, John came home holding a crumpled permission slip for a school trip. "Can I go?" he asked hesitantly, gripping the paper like it might disappear. Emily knelt beside him, gently taking the slip from his hands. "Of course, sweetheart." His eyes widened. "Really? Really?" He smiled, a real, unguarded, joyful smile. It was the first time he had ever felt safe enough to ask for something without fear of rejection. And Emily knew he was healing. There was one thing left to do. One unfinished piece of John's story that Emily needed to share with him. One afternoon, she asked him, "Would you like to visit your father?" John blinked up at her, confused. "My father?" Emily's voice was gentle. "Yes, sweetheart. David, your father. The man who loved you before you were even born." John hesitated. "Where is he?" Emily exhaled softly. "He's not with us anymore, but we can visit him, if you want." John thought for a moment, then nodded. "I want to go." The cemetery was quiet, the cool breeze rustling the leaves as Emily and John walked toward the gravestone. Emily carried a bouquet of white lilies, David's favorite flowers. When they reached his grave, she knelt down, brushing her fingers over the engraved name. David Carter, beloved son, husband, and father. John stood beside her, his hands clasped in front of him. "He was a good man," Emily said softly. looking at the tombstone. He wanted nothing more than to meet you, to hold you in his arms. John swallowed hard, his small fingers reaching out hesitantly to trace the carved letters of his father's name. I wish I could have met him, he whispered. Emily placed a hand on his shoulder. He would have been so proud of you. John. John's lips trembled. Do you think he would have loved me? Emily's eyes filled with tears. Oh, sweetheart, he already did. From the moment he knew you existed. John took a deep breath and slowly placed his hand over his heart. I hope he knows I love him too, he whispered. Emily squeezed his shoulder. I promise you. He does. They stood in silence for a long while, the weight of the past settling, but not in sadness, in peace. And when they walked away that day, John no longer felt like a boy without a father. He felt like a son who had finally come home. As time passed, John flourished. His once uncertain steps became confident strides. His once hesitant smiles turned into bright laughter. His once fearful heart learned what it meant to be loved. And as he stood next to Emily on his first day of middle school, looking up at her with grateful eyes, he reached for her hand and whispered, "Thank you for finding me." Emily smiled, squeezing his fingers gently. "Thank you for coming home." And with that, they stepped forward toward a future filled with love, belonging, and the promise of never being alone again. Love this content? Like the video and subscribe for more amazing updates. Share your thoughts below. Your support means to us.